Welcome to UN This Week, Tuesday, July 14th. This is Adam Carroll of Justice for All. Today is Bastille Day, at least in France, which at least in theory is a human rights holiday, marking the anniversary of the storming of the Grand Prison Fortress, infamous for holding political prisoners during the hopeful first moments of the French Revolution. Perhaps even more to the point, in 3 days on July 17th, it will be International Justice Day, commemorating the historic adoption of the Rome Statute in July 17, 1998, an international agreement that has greatly strengthened the fight against injustice and brought hope to the victims of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. The Rome Statute, signed by 139 states, or 137 now, is the treaty that created the International Criminal Court that the Trump administration, among others, is currently extremely hostile to. And therefore, it is extremely fitting to speak today with Anji Manivannan, the Director of Programs at the World Federalist Movement Institute for Global Policy, taking a lead in atrocity prevention and holding nations accountable for crimes against humanity. This work includes the Coalition for the International Criminal Court, a court which we'll be speaking about today, as well as the International Court of Justice. Prior to joining the Institute, Ms. Manivannan worked at local organizations in India, Palestine, and West Africa, and worked on issues in Sri Lanka. This past weekend, some of us remembered the 25th anniversary of the genocidal mass killing of Bosnian Muslim men in Srebrenica. And every day this week at 3 p.m., our Justice for Now programming is remembering and discussing the Bosnian Genocide. The world's failure to stop this and other genocides in the 1990s, Rwanda and former Yugoslavia, embarrassed the world's leadership enough to lead to an independent, permanent international criminal court powerful enough to hold accountable those most responsible for serious crimes, regardless of their rank. So, welcome to the show, Anji. And my first question to you is, thinking of that effort of political will in 1998, could such a decision be made now, considering the prevailing politics of 2020? And why or why not?
First, let me thank you, Adam, for reaching out and inviting me to be part of this program. I hope this is a useful and informative experience for everyone who's watching. To answer your question about whether or not the Rome Statute and the ICC would be possible in today's day and age, unfortunately, I think that would not be the case because the current political climate is extremely hostile. Multilateralism in general. Back in the 90s, it was a very different political climate. And I think those of us who've lived through the 90s and lived through today have some sort of at least anecdotal sense of how different the world was just in general and how the world responded to multilateral institutions and the need to have these forms of accountability. The ICC's history with respect to the United States has varied during that time. Under the Clinton administration, the U.S. did sign the Rome Statute under George W. Bush. Then the U.S. withdrew its signature, and then under Obama, there was less hostility and there was diplomatic engagements with the court. And now under Trump, we see the most hostility that there has been to date with sanctions against the court, threats against personnel. And it's not just about the ICC. We can see that under the Trump administration, there's hostility to other multilateral UN systems, such as the UN Human Rights Council, which is not an individual criminal responsibility body, but the US still withdrew from the Human Rights Council just a few years back, I think in 2016. I might be blanking on the exact date, but some very, very recently under this administration. It's just a testament towards, I think, a strong shift towards this America's first. And America is not the only country that's doing this. And I think it's also indicative of a lot of the right-wing nationalism that is occurring in the US that's very hostile towards engaging in the international system the way the US used to.
There used to be, and maybe still are, conspiracy theories about one world government and the black helicopters of the United Nations, and no doubt having something to do with George Soros as well. So that sort of hostility and paranoia about multilateralism, which is a form of leadership where you are at the table with other leaders, it seems to be neglected at best. And the hostility, President Trump referred to himself this past week when he finally wore a mask. He said he felt like the Lone Ranger. And I think that he is the Lone Ranger in terms of the international stage, where he goes it alone and doesn't play nicely with others. Or maybe we're all Tonto, I don't know. But when I look at the other signers, and I guess there are signers to the Rome Statute, and then there are parties to the statute. And maybe you could let us know what the difference is. But I see, just thinking of some of our viewers, that there are a number of countries missing. Pakistan is missing, but Bangladesh is a signer. Russia and China are not. Many European countries are. Saudi Arabia is not. So it's interesting to see who's there and who's not, but Tunisia is. So I was wondering what your thoughts are about its prospects to be more widely adopted, and what does it mean to be a signer and not a party?
So there are now 123 states parties to the ICC, and that means that they have accepted the jurisdiction of the court. Being a signatory is, I suppose, a bit reductively, you're on the path to ratification, but that final step hasn't been implemented yet. So if we take the example of the U.S., there was a signature, but there was never a full ratification. So the U.S. never became a state party, but was at one point a signatory to the Rome Statute. With respect to the geographic scope of the ICC, of course, joining the court is voluntary. It's something that states undertake on their own. So I think that there is a clear absence of states. I think that they have, especially within their government, they have perpetrated atrocity crimes. Another example in Asia Pacific, anyway, is Sri Lanka. My background is my family are Tamil people from Sri Lanka, and so we come from a conflict-affected part of that island, and that's another country where there's really no interest in signing or ratifying the Rome Statute, because that will directly implicate government officials. Myanmar or Burma is another example of a country that is not a party to the Rome Statute, but because Bangladesh is, and I think maybe we'll speak about this a bit more later too, the ICC was able to look into the crimes that were committed against the Rohingya via their forced deportation or their forced displacement from Myanmar or Burma. The court uses Myanmar as the state name, and then into Bangladesh, which is the state party.
Yes, that was very heartening. That the prosecutor Fatou Bensouda was willing to explore that, and then ensure that the judges consider the mass displacement, which affects Bangladesh so much, as well as the refugees themselves. So we can speak about the Rohingya in a moment a little further, especially regarding the other court. But I wanted to ask just a little more about your background. You mentioned Sri Lanka, and of course there was a terrible, would you call it a civil war, a terrible conflict?
Yes.
And that it was now, as far as transitional justice goes, holding perpetrators of mass atrocities accountable. What mechanism does exist?
So before coming into this position, and also as a volunteer for about a decade, I have worked with a Tamil diaspora group that focuses on accountability efforts, and mostly it's international accountability efforts, because I think like Burma, there's a lot of impunity is very deeply enshrined for members of the military and members of government. So the only hope for accountability exists in an internationalized system. There was a Human Rights Council process that began in 2015 after a change in government. So there was the wartime president, his name was Mahinda Rajapaksa. He remained president after the war for some years until 2015. He was voted out of office, and then there was another president who made some efforts. It seems really to be like window dressing efforts, though, with the international community to show that Sri Lanka is here for transitional justice. Sri Lanka is here to try and get justice for Tamil people. But in reality, they never followed through on any of their promises, including low-hanging fruit, one of which was releasing the names of some hundreds of thousands of disappeared persons in Sri Lanka, mostly Tamils. And so there have been women who have been protesting actually out on the street in Sri Lanka. So you can imagine the weather being very, very hostile there for some years, I think since 2017 or 2018. And even though they've had meetings with that government, nothing ever really came to pass. And then in the most recent presidential election, the Mahinda Rajapaksa's brother, who was the defense secretary at the time of the war, he is now the current president. So all of those even window dressing steps have been rolled back on. So we've sort of gone back a bit. And I'll also say that since I mentioned the part about the U.S. withdrawing from the Human Rights Council, it was quite a setback for us too, because we had strong engagements with the U.S. Both in D.C. and in Geneva. And so then when they stopped playing a role, we had other connections to other states who were involved in this process, but the U.S. had been a champion in that respect, and I'm sure on other issues. And then having them pull out, of course, was quite upsetting as a community.
Mm-hmm. It's unfortunate that that only about a year ago at Easter time, there were these terrible terrorist attacks on churches in Sri Lanka. Earlier, the Tamil and what was the other community? Sorry, I'm thinking of it in religious terms of Buddhist versus Hindu.
The main ethnic communities there are Tamil people. Religiously, Tamil people are typically Hindu, but there's also in Sri Lanka of the Christian population, I think it's about 50-50, like 50% of Christians might be Sinhalese, I think is the one you were trying to remember, or Tamil. But Tamils are often Hindu or Muslims. Muslim Tamils tend to identify as Muslim. They identify with their religion more than with their language. Sinhalese people are the ones mostly Buddhists, and Sri Lanka is a Buddhist very Buddhist nationalist country, which and the issues that led to the armed conflict there were ones related to just decades of post-independence structural discrimination against non-Sinhalese people.
Well, without some sort of accountability and justice, it's much easier to perpetuate this cycle of violence and retribution.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that in other countries. So we really do count on some of these international justice mechanisms, though they run very slowly. And that's been one complaint about them. I wanted to ask about some of the different cases, and I wanted to maybe take a look at your website for a second. By the way, how did your organization come to be? It seems to be a combination of different organizations working together.
Yes, WFMIGP, who's my organization, also hosts the secretariat of some different movements, some different coalitions, including the Coalition for the ICC. And here is the ICC's website. also the International Coalition for the Responsibility to Protect. And then there is sort of the bread and butter of why we were founded, which is the World Federalist Movement. And that movement was established shortly after World War II. And that is world federalism in the very multilateral sense. For those of you who are familiar with the US context, federalism has a very like a right-wing conservative connotation to it. But when we say federalism in the international context, and I think this is how Europeans understand it as well, it's referring to being part of a bigger international system. And so that's the other movement. So we are the secretariat for these three different movements. And the CICC, since we'll be talking quite a bit about the ICC, the Coalition for the ICC, or the CICC, led civil society efforts in campaigning for the establishment for the Rome Statute and the establishment of the International Criminal Court. And so that's actually very exciting to be part of a movement that was involved in such an important process. Of course, I wasn't involved in 1998, but hearing those stories and being part of that is quite exciting. And it's our 25th anniversary this year as well of the CICC.
And so the CICC is helping the ICC and trying to strengthen it and provide community and leadership support. Now, we have here in front of us situations under investigation. So if you could maybe explain what that is, and we'll very, very slowly scroll down. But just maybe in general, if you could speak about what the process is and what, some of the main countries under investigation.
So the situations under investigation, this is where you'll actually see cases and indictments and hopefully convictions. Some of the countries that are under investigation or have been under investigation are, yes, there's DRC, there's Uganda, you're scrolling past them before you even get to them. Darfur was the one that was referred by the Security Council. There's, I think, the Central African Republic. I believe there's two there. Kenya, the Bangladesh/Myanmar is another one. Libya is another one that was referred by the Security Council. So you'll notice that a number of these are countries that are in Africa, which has been a critique of the court. But it's important to note that that if you look at a map of, and I should have sent a link to this, but on the ICC's website, you can find a map of all the different parties that have ratified the Rome Statute. So the different states parties to the ICC, and you'll see that there is a number of African countries have ratified the Rome Statute. And so that means that the court is able to exercise jurisdiction, but that's only if the domestic system is unable or unwilling to investigate and prosecute. The ICC is a court of last resort. It does not just jump into every single atrocity crimes issue that exists. It's only if the domestic system is unable or unwilling to investigate and prosecute.
I understand there's a principle of complementarity.
That's it.
Which I guess is that the international justice system is not meant to replace justice at home, but to complement what it can't do. And exactly. I guess it can't really hold leaders accountable for genocide and war crimes in most cases, whether it's for political reasons or perhaps legal. I'm not sure.
So when states parties should be domesticating the Rome Statute. So taking the crimes that exist in the Rome Statute, so war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and also the crime of aggression, and then putting it into their domestic legal infrastructure. But one of the other challenges that exists, I think, even for a country that wants to investigate and prosecute, is that after going through mass atrocities and possibly for many years, it's very damaging to the judicial system and the infrastructure, and it's possible that there is brain drain. An example of a non-ICC situation is that I believe, I can't remember the exact number, but it was by the time the genocide in Rwanda ended, they had, I think, single digits of lawyers and judges who were left in the country because the others had been killed or they had fled. It's a very, very small number. So their judicial infrastructure was completely decimated. And that happens in many other countries too, where that they simply didn't have, even if it is a country that has a good a good legal system or judicial system, they might not have the expertise to deal with these specific sorts of crimes. And that, I think, is particularly important when you're dealing with the sexual and gender-based violence crimes that are often domestic systems don't even do a good job with that, domestically speaking, but then there's an added layer to it when you're dealing with these situations of extraordinary crimes.
So we're looking at another page which says preliminary examinations. If maybe you could speak to what this is, and maybe we can scroll down slowly and take a look.
Yeah, so the preliminary examination is the stage before a situation goes under investigation, and it can be initiated based off of information that's provided to the office of the prosecutor, or I think right here where your cursor is actually pointing to some different ways that it could be opened. So there's a way to make submissions to the office of the prosecutor so that he or she can assess whether or not to move forward and look into something. And then there'll be a more in-depth investigation, not to use confusing language, examination, I suppose, before determining whether or not to move that into an investigation phase. So here you won't see names of individuals. It's like an examination of a whole situation. One that I think is relevant in relation to our discussion about hostility is Palestine. Israel is also very hostile towards the court. Israel is not a party to the court, but the state of Palestine is. And there have been another number of questions about statehood and jurisdiction, and but you'll see it as you scroll down. I think it's one of the more recent ones. The one in Colombia, I know, is a very long-lasting preliminary examination. I can't remember off the top of my head how long it's been going on. And Colombia is a very interesting, I think, situation, just academically speaking, as far as justice goes, because there are some different mechanisms that exist domestically. It is also a party to the ICC, and it's recovering from decades of armed conflict.
Mm-hmm. What stage then is the Burma case, the Rohingya genocide, basically, but the mass displacement that affects Bangladesh?
Yes, that's under investigation right now. So you could find it on the ICC's page. It's called Bangladesh/Myanmar.
Mm-hmm. And I understand that the court itself does interact with the impacted communities. There's a victims fund, something like that.
Yes.
And there can be my own organization worked with a lawyer to build up testimony into a victim statement. That in a way it's like friends of court kind of thing. So what other actions take place around the court that involve the impacted communities?
Let me see. So with the trust fund for victims, I believe that's also where money that's where reparations come out of when the convicted person is indigent, as many times I think they end up being. They just don't have the resources, the defendant. The court also, I can at least speak to their engagements through civil society that's often represented by, that often includes victims groups such as the CICC. We actually have more regular engagements with the court thanks to, I don't want to say thanks to, but in some ways I think that this pandemic has opened up the whole virtual world that didn't exist before. Like previously, when you could not have a Zoom or a WebEx meeting with a policymaker or a court official, that's all changed because they've been forced to work virtually. Otherwise, they have to deal with other kinds of procedural issues with their own cases. And so we do have, there are engagements that the CICC facilitates with the court for victims to represent their views. I have not been part of all of those, and I've been working with the CICC aspect in my role only for the past few months or so. But this is one way that takes place, and I think they try to be receptive to needs. I think there are also issues, I think, between maybe headquarters and their local level presences that just happens to exist in most international institutions.
Mm. Does politics, or rather geopolitics, get in the way of state support? I mean, we've kind of alluded to that already, but in your own experience, um, you know, have you seen any cases slowed down or derailed by that sort of pressure?
I know some cases can be affected by threats against, for instance, witnesses or human rights defenders in the country. I believe this happened in the Kenya situation. That's the state itself, the state party, attacking people who were going to come and provide testimony or evidence against it. So in that way, there is clearly a political slant, and I think that even if it's a case against an individual who is no longer in politics, unless there's a total regime change, I think it's very likely in a number of these countries, and I think just in most countries in general, that people have connections, and they tend to be the ones who are at the highest level anyway. They will have more influence, I think, even in a successive regime, or if it's one that they were friendly with. I think we can see how geopolitics plays in light of these recent sanctions against the court that came out from the U.S. anyway. I think there's some concerns that this could even be like an existential threat to the court. There's a real need to rally behind it, to get states parties to show their support, to show their public support. But I think it's also becomes concerning for NGOs who are working in this space to find out whether or not they are implicated. Like, will they be affected by these sanctions? My organization is, and I think others too, are speaking to the lawyers to make sure that we are in the clear. And we have a Hague headquarters and also a New York headquarters. I'm speaking from our New York office. And then with other states, parties even that have close alliances to the U.S. or a desire to stay in the good books of the U.S., there's a possibility that it could influence some of their support when it comes to cooperation. So I think I'm speaking to issues that concern the corporate or maybe outside the exact procedural aspects of a case. But I think this may be food for thought in some ways that geopolitics does play into the system as a whole.
Right. I mean, I guess U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo referred to the court as a kangaroo court, and made insinuations that it was corrupt and so forth, and did mention in his statement at great length, actually, Israel, which it feels like that is part of the calculation. The U.S. government's wish to protect its ally. As much as any armed services personnel that might be implicated in war crimes in Afghanistan. So I guess the threat and the policy now is to put sanctions or visa sanctions on people working for the actual court. And I hope that it won't affect you. And I know that we invited people from the court to participate in an online conference next month. You don't need a visa to do a Zoom conference, but it's unfortunate. It sends the wrong message, and also it sends the wrong message to perpetrators of genocide. That we're not prioritizing human rights protections as a nation. Anyway, as the UN goes, do you feel that the Secretary General is firmly behind the court system?
Let me see. I think for me to comment on the UN, I suppose I'll say that this is me speaking maybe in a personal capacity, has to do with having seen that the UN can, even when they make that, you see a strong statement. And if we look at, for example, on how the UN Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire actually trickled down into practice with the Security Council, I suppose I think more about the lived experience, like the actual implementation of any statements. Off the top of my head, I can't think of anything egregious that has come out from the Secretary General. So in that way, I would say that yes, I expect like there's a lot of what's the word? It's sort of lip service that anyone can give to the court. But what really comes in is then putting your foot down and trying to actually make sure that there are changes that need to take place with respect to resources, or even with respect to, and I mean, how much the Secretary General can actually influence this too is really, it's not necessarily that role's fault when it comes to the Security Council and getting referrals to the ICC. I mean, that's another way of showing that the court is important, is that even for for non-states parties, where there are many and where there are atrocity crimes, and several of them that have yet to be addressed domestically or in another system, but to have those referrals from the Security Council, and we saw that with Darfur, and we saw that with Libya, and that was several years ago with Libya, and then there hasn't been anything since. I mean, with Syria, it comes up, and then there's a veto. And so the veto is, I think, a whole other discussion that would take another 40 minutes to unpack. I did also want to just quickly comment, though, on when you were talking about, the U.S. has a strong desire, of course, to protect its own soldiers, to protect American soldiers in relation to Afghanistan, to protect its allies in relation to Israel and the preliminary examination in Palestine. And I just wanted to add, for probably most of you do know, that it's a real shame, because the U.S. has a long history of being a champion of international criminal justice that dates back to the Nuremberg trials. And although those were flawed, they were the groundwork for the international criminal justice system that we see today. And so when we look at what happened over half a century ago, it's much more than that now, so in the 40s, and then we look at today, it's just such a stark difference between the role that the U.S. government played back then, and then to see it worsen over time when it should actually improve, having seen the outcomes, the positive outcomes that can come from international criminal justice systems. And by now there have been many more than just Nuremberg, Rwanda, former Yugoslavia, hybrid tribunals as well. And the fact that the U.S. was involved and supported those institutions, it's a real shame. And I also thought I would add that, in relation to Darfur, even though the U.S. is not supporting the court, the U.S. abstained from that particular vote, I believe, for Sudan to get referred to the ICC.
That's distressing. Okay, we have one moment for commercial break. Commercial meaning to identify that we're with Justice for All. And you can go to our website. You can also watch us on Muslim Network TV. And this show will air on that platform as well. So, three things come to mind. Let's see if I can remember all three. One is, again, addressing the hybrid courts and the response of African countries to feeling singled out. Another is just a brief comparison of the International Court of Justice to the ICC, because these are huge topics, but just a basic comparison. And then maybe we could end with talking about human rights defenders and how there's a community working to support and strengthen international human rights at the courts. Yeah.
So on the first point about African countries, I think there have been some unfair, it seems unfair criticisms of the ICC that it's unfairly targeting African countries, which for the reasons that I explained before are not exactly true. Within the African system, the African Union just celebrated in February 1 year of having an AU transitional justice policy that it's asking member states to sort of adopt and domesticate. I believe Uganda has made some process there, so it's a bit slow going, but that policy has a strong recognition of the need for more domestically grown processes. And the truth is that is still where most international justice or justice for these crimes, even if they are not necessarily labeled as mass atrocity crimes, it's still taking place within a country, because the international system it's very slow, it's very expensive. This is not something that's true of just the ICC, but these hybrid tribunals are also very costly. And in since the ICC came to be, I think as of the end of last year or so, there were maybe 9 convictions and 4 acquittals. So it's a much slower process than domestically speaking. And so I know that there are a number of countries that are setting up either hybrid or special tribunals. I think South Sudan, the Central African Republic, just to name a couple, and Sierra Leone has already had a special court that was set up to address, and that was a hybrid system. By hybrid, I mean there are international actors and then also domestic actors from that specific country who are involved as judges and as lawyers. On the second point, which is about Burma and the situation of the Rohingya, to compare the ICC and the ICJ. So the ICC is a court that deals with individual criminal responsibility. So that means people, individuals, are held criminally responsible. It's similar to what happens in the domestic systems of most of the world, I think, if not all the world, where you have an investigation, you have a prosecution, and then a person is convicted or acquitted. The International Court of Justice is deals with state responsibility. So here there would be a finding against the state, so against the state of Myanmar. And this case came to be because the Gambia initiated a case against Myanmar under the Genocide Convention. So the Genocide Convention, and I believe all the UN human rights treaties have an article in there that mentions the International Court of Justice as a dispute mechanism. There haven't been many cases in this respect. There was a case that Bosnia brought against Serbia under genocide, and there was a case under the Convention Against Torture that had to do with extradition, and then this fed into what ultimately became the extraordinary chambers that dealt with Hissène Habré, the former Chadian dictator. But I think it's a novel mechanism, and I expect, I have not worked too closely on this particular issue with affected communities, but if I'm comparing it to the situation I feel as a Tamil person in the face of impunity, try to explore just all the creative options that you can get. And in some ways, I think it's inspiring that even though Myanmar is so entrenched in impunity, that there are still these steps that are being taken. So that it was still what came out of the ICC, that there is a situation, there is this case at the ICJ, and whatever the outcome is, it shows that there's been action taken. And I think that does matter to affected communities, that there's attention being paid to that.
Just to add in there that the provisional measures, the 4 provisional measures that the ICJ issued in January this year do create a process of, at least in theory, building a sense of accountability, and also named the Rohingya as a protected class. And the government of Burma or Myanmar still doesn't name the Rohingya by their name. And so we don't know how they get around that in their 3-month or 4-month report, because they just in late May issued their first report to the court, which unfortunately is secret. Yes. And so a lot of us are calling for that to be made public, so that there can be accountability at that level of the process. But it certainly does give hope to Rohingya and others in Burma that there can be some effective pressure from the outside. Many layers to this, and as we're slowly approaching the 3rd anniversary of the 2017 genocide and mass displacement. So we're all anxious to see more access to the UN. That's still, I believe today in Geneva, there's actually a meeting with the special rapporteur on this issue, and many states in the Human Rights Council are pushing Burma to allow more access to the special rapporteur and others. But anyway, you were going to also mention the community of human rights defenders, and maybe we can see a list of some of them, and other agencies, other NGOs that work to strengthen the ICC. While we wait for that to get on the page, maybe you could speak a bit about what your NGO does.
Sure. The CICC anyway, I'll just use that as an example since we spent a lot of time talking about international criminal justice. So is made of, we have over 2,500 members who are around the world. It's very global, and it's global in the sense that it's actually global. It's not dominated. It's not only in Europe and America, but really around the world on the ground. What we're seeing on the screen here is a list of in 150 different countries, a list of some of the different activists in various parts of the world who campaign for to strengthen and to protect the ICC. They work on their own domestic issues if they're in a country, for instance, that is under investigation or is in a preliminary examination or is one that's going through mass atrocities. So they deal with other things. It's a very varied group, but we all come together with our support for the ICC as an important judicial mechanism, it's a necessary institution to end impunity. And I've had the pleasure of meeting some of these people, but not all of them. I think there's a woman from Colombia on here, and also from Mali, maybe, who are featured.
Yeah, you mentioned Mali. I mean, I was just hearing today on the BBC about that case, having to do partly with the destruction of tombs and historical monuments and so forth. You go ahead, please.
Just out of I think Mali, there was some interesting jurisprudence anyway that was related to the destruction of cultural property at the ICC. And I suppose one of the unfortunate parts of how slow the international criminal justice system moves is it also affects how long it takes to see some jurisprudence that could maybe be informative for other jurisdictions as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, as we wind up our show today, is there any thought or suggestion you have for viewers about what they can do? I mean, they can certainly learn more and go to your website. Is there anything else that they could consider doing to be supportive of the international courts?
I suppose for people who are, just your individual activists, do try to stay informed of these issues. I think talk about the importance of the court, just even, I think, on a basic level, like sharing that information, because depending on where you live, and this is true in the US, for example, like many people don't understand what is the International Criminal Court. We're very much I'm using just we very generally, but like in a bubble, in an American bubble, where since the ICC is not something that really affects us or seems to, even though there is this discussion about Afghanistan going on, it's not something that people are even aware of exists. And if I think about my own education, I don't think I ever learned about the UN in high school, or it wasn't until university that it really came up. And it was just from watching the news that I think I even knew what these institutions were. And people are not always paying attention to that. At the same time, I think that people are paying attention because of social media, and people are just constantly looking at these things all the time. So I think I would, in addition to just staying informed, if there is, say, a coalition for the ICC in your own country. I'm actually not sure where all the viewers are coming or listening or watching now or are going to listen later, but you could consider reaching out to them and seeing how you could support their advocacy efforts, which I think will vary from country to country, as well as from different governmental systems. But I would think that would be a good start. And then also to maybe just in your day-to-day express your support for the court. I think that people pay attention to this. Certainly the US administration is constantly on social media saying nonsense, but these things, I think that the court officials also pay attention to where the support is coming from, where there is this movement on the ground. And I think, I mean, if you really wanted to get involved or to learn more, there's the contact information on the CICC's page that will go to one of my colleagues who will be happy to give you more information. But there's a lot of resources on there to just learn more about the court and also about what the coalition does.
Great. And actually, I'm going to give the last word to somebody in the community who is making a comment. Abdul Hadar writes, "Nonviolence is the greatest force at the disposal of mankind. It is mightier than the mightiest weapon of destruction devised by the ingenuity of man." Mahatma Gandhi. So that's an inspiring quote to chew on. And maybe as we go out, we're all interested here in promoting the UN, what's good about it, what can be reformed, being honest about that. And we'll put up a brief ad for our show this coming Thursday, which will be with the UN Association of the USA Executive Director Rachel Pittman will speak about how we can save the United Nations at this time of crisis. So thank you very much, Anji, for being on the show. Enjoyed the discussion, and perhaps come on again.
Yes, thank you very much for having me, and I would love the opportunity to speak with you. I hope everyone learned a bit about the importance of international justice and the ICC.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.